I'm now going to be showing you tons of different techniques for using vectors with MoGraph cloners and also different cloning techniques. There are a ton of ways to create scenes and decide exactly where instances are going to be going for creating large scenes, small scenes, and we're going to start out by taking a look at some of the influences of the MoGraph weight, or the cloner object weights, and the different effectors, and how those play a very significant role in the way scenes are created. So I'm going to start by adding in our landscape object, which is going to be used to place the clones on top of. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the width and depth segments to 200 on the terrain. I'm going to turn off the border at sea level and the multifractal, and just give us a little rough terrain to work with. And now we can add in the cloner object, and we need to decide what we're going to be using for clones. You can start out with, sometimes what's really simple to do is just using a box or cube. I'm going to create a very simple kind of Previz object, and just starting with, actually we'll go ahead and use a cylinder. Set the rotation segments to 3, and I'm going to scale this down, and we're just going to make kind of a little tree. So that way we have something that's a little larger on top and then smaller on the bottom. And then I'm going to add next a sphere. We can go ahead and scale that down. And kind of put that on top. And we don't want to use this much geometry. So we can reduce some of our segment amounts and find something that's going to work out well. We'll use the isohedron segments at 4. And that'll work fairly well to kind of represent a tree. And hit C on the keyboard to bake it. I'm going to turn down falling angle a little. Turn off the angle limit on the cylinder, and then C on the keyboard to make the cylinder also editable. Create a connect object. Add those to the connect object. I'm going to turn off the weld option, because I could just modify the geometry manually and then make that editable. C on the keyboard, or selecting the make editable. So call this tree Previz. If you want, you could also set up some different material tags for it. You can go ahead and just select these bottom polygons. And actually, we don't want to have these additional ones on the bottom, so I probably should have edited the caps, but I'm going to select the polygons on the bottom, what would be the trunk, and we can choose, we'll go ahead and use the regular menus, so you know where to get this from. Go to functions, and we can melt it. Don't see any additional points. We're also going to go back up to the top. We can select those polygons, and we can bring them down. Actually, we can go ahead, and since they're not connected, we can just delete them. That makes it a little bit easier. Grab those points on the side, and we can delete the extra points, or you can use optimize and then remove any additional points that way. And I may need to do that for the bottom because it's not connected. But we'll start right there. I'm going to grab the polygons around the edges, go to selection, set the selection, and call this trunk. and then select the polygons on top, we can use the select connected, and then we got to make sure we deselect that tag. So you can just click off the object and select the object again, and then set the selection. We'll just call this leaves. And then I'm going to go to the structure. So select the object, deselect everything, go to structure, functions. Select optimize, click OK, and it's going to remove any additional points from the bottom and the rest of the object. So taking care of those cap points. We can set up a few materials for this. Just call this one leaves, and we can call the other one trunk. Just to give us a little better visual representation, assign both of these to the object, and then the trunk will set to the trunk selection, leaves to the leaves selection, and then we can modify the materials, just double-clicking, going to the color, and changing the trunk color to more of a grayer brown, and then going to the leaves material and setting that to green. So that gives us something to work with. If you want to change the scales, this is really just for previewing purposes, so you don't have to go very far in depth. But it's nice to have a pretty decent representation of the object. So we can start with that, and we have a tree for Previz. If you want, you can go to the material, and in front, viz underscore, just to separate it from any finite or final materials that you're going to end up using. So switch over to the model mode. We can Control C to copy, and then switch over to the other scene, paste it in. Also want to make sure, and it looks like because we did use the connect object and we didn't really move anything, that the object axis is set correctly, so we don't need to worry about making any changes there. The overall scale might need to be changed, but we'll see that once we start cloning. So another good idea is to take those materials and add them in to a new layer. You can double-click on the layer and call this Previz. So that way we can separate that a little more. We can also add this layer to the object for the tree to the Previz layer. I'm also going to set up a new material. Select Previz, double-click. It looks like it's not adding it to the Previz layer, so we'll just do that manually. And then I'm going to call this terrain, because this is just going to be a temporary material. We'll drag it onto the terrain. We can edit it, and we'll change the color to kind of a browner color, just to separate it a little bit more from the other object. It's too close to the trunk. Maybe we'll go ahead and increase it to, or change it to more of a green. That's going to be a lot different. But still bright enough to show correctly. So now we can take this, and we need to first set up our cloner object. So going to the attributes of the cloner object, we're going to set this to the object mode, and we're going to drag the landscape into the object, and setting the mode to surface or volume in the surface. We don't have any selection set up yet, but we do have it where we will be able to take this tree, add it to the cloner, and not have all that many being created. So back in the cloner object, we need to take a look at setting it up so that they're rotated correctly. We can either use, if we use the up vector, it's really not going to correct it, because we do need to use the transformation. So if we go to transform, we can use a -90 on the pitch, which will place them upward. When you're using, we'll go back to the object mode, using the up vector can have a huge impact, really depending on basically the edge polygons that it's connecting to. In this case, we see them bending and basically going somewhat horizontal and being more perpendicular to the polygons it's placed on. A lot of that has to do with the align clone option. If we turn off align clone, Now we can turn off that additional transformation, and all of our trees are going upward, which is a lot more realistic. In this way, we have a little bit better control. Even though they're all facing the same direction, setting this up ahead of time makes it a lot easier when we get into the next sections, controlling with the different effectors the random rotations and placements. So going to the cloner, I'm also going to turn on render instances because I do not want all these extra objects being created. What I can also do just for previewing purposes of the scene, if we go to the material for the leaves, I'm going to turn on the luminance channel, set that to kind of a lighter green, and then we can kind of turn that down. That way we can still see that part of the object showing pretty well. We can also add in an environment object, turn on environment color, selecting kind of a bluish tone, which is going to set up our ambient light, and increase that a little. That might be a little too intense of a blue, so we can tone that down, desaturate it. Now, because we're almost always going to be using additional objects, and not just one object, and because a lot of the effectors do modify the clone list, or how many we're going to have, it's a good idea to also have additional previz objects. So I'm going to copy and paste 2 additional previz objects, and we can just modify the name. So we have 2 and 3. Also going to the materials, so that way we know which is going to be which. Select the leaves, copy and paste, and then we'll do leaves 2 and leaves 3. We want to modify the color, or you could just modify luminance, which will have a pretty good impact. I'll make this one a little more green. Go into the material for the third one, modify the luminance on this one to set it a little more yellow, and then modify, make it a little more green. So now we go to the materials, and we're going to drag these and replace the current leaf materials. So 2 on 2, 3 on 3. And since the tag is already set up to the selection, just dragging and dropping over the addition or the existing one is going to make it a little bit easier. So now we can see how the additional clones are going to be showing and modified. If you want to set up additional scales on those clones, you can select the object, go to Model, and then reduce the size. I'm going to keep it pretty much stationary because the effectors we're going to be using will also modify some of the scales. So this way we can have a pretty good idea of how much scale change there's going to be without having to figure out, well, this object's smaller, and if we really need to, we can scale them down later to figure out the final objects. And of course, all of these can always be replaced with the actual rendered object, or the object we're going to be using for the render. And I just went ahead and changed the trunk color a little more brown to separate it. So I'm going to go ahead and save the scene, and it's called clone placement _000. So this is a starting point. You can go ahead and start with this if you want, or create your own scene.